New Year's Eve should have been an easy shift. At 17, I was working the closing hours at the local CVS, a quiet store on the edge of town. Most people were out celebrating, and the few customers that came in were just grabbing last-minute items for their parties. I was used to the solitude of late-night shifts, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the soft clink of the register drawer. But that night, something felt off. It started with the tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, rattling the windows. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. I looked around the store, but everything seemed normal. The aisles were empty, the shelves well stocked. I tried to ignore the tapping, focusing on finishing my task at the register. Then, the door opened. A man walked in, his coat heavy with snow, his face obscured by the hood. He didn't look like a regular customer. His eyes were wild, scanning the store as if he didn't know what he was looking for. I smiled awkwardly, hoping to break the tension, but he didn't respond. He just stood there. The tapping started again, louder now, echoing through the store. My nerves began to fray. It was like something in the air had shifted, an undercurrent of unease crawling up my spine. I glanced at the clock. There were only 10 minutes left until closing, but something about the man's presence made the minutes drag on. I went back to my work, pretending to focus on the register, when I heard it, a scrape, followed by a thud. I turned, and there he was, standing much closer than before, staring at me. "Can I help you?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, almost as if he was studying me. And then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." I took a step back. "I'm closing soon. Are you going to buy something?" The man didn't move. His eyes narrowed. "You should leave before it's too late." He lunged toward me, his hand reaching for my arm. Without thinking, I bolted. I ran toward the front doors, slamming the locked door behind me. I didn't even look back as I sprinted to the employee entrance, locking it behind me with shaking hands. I pressed my back to the wall, my heart pounding as I listened. The rhythmic sound of the tapping continued, coming from inside the store. It was as if someone was trying to break through. I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. When they arrived, they searched the store, but there was no sign of the man. No trace of him anywhere. They told me it was likely just someone playing a prank, but I knew better. The way he looked at me, the way the tapping echoed through the store, it was real. New Year's Eve at 18 was supposed to be unforgettable, and it was, but not in the way I'd hoped. My family had booked a cruise to Antarctica, a once-in-a-lifetime trip that I'd been counting down to for months. The ship was enormous, practically a floating city, and I spent the first few days exploring every deck. But by the third night, the initial excitement began to wear off. The ship felt quieter as we sailed deeper into the Antarctic waters. That night, restless and unable to sleep, I decided to go for a walk, thinking the cold air and empty halls might clear my head. I found myself on the observation deck, staring out at the endless dark ocean when someone spoke behind me. Couldn't sleep either. I turned to see a boy about my age, leaning casually against the railing. He introduced himself as David. There was something about him, his confident smirk, the way he leaned in slightly too close, that put me on edge. We started talking, and he asked where I was from, if I was enjoying the cruise, the usual small talk. But then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Want to see something cool?" I hesitated. "What kind of cool?" He grinned, a sly, mischievous grin. "I know all the ship's secrets. Places they don't want us to go. I can show you." I should have walked away then, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed him as he led me down a set of stairs to one of the lower decks. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every step you take. He stopped in front of a cabin door and whispered, "This one's empty. Want to see inside? Isn't that against the rules?" I asked nervously. David chuckled. "Rules are for people who don't know how to have fun." He pulled out a key card and swiped it. The door clicked open, and he motioned for me to follow. I stayed frozen in place. "Come on," he urged. "You're not scared, are you?" Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. I shook my head and stammered, "Actually, I should get back. My parents will worry if I'm gone too long." David's expression darkened for a moment, but then he shrugged. Suit yourself. But you're missing out. I hurried back to my cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The next morning, the ship was abuzz with gossip. Security had caught someone breaking into passenger cabins, stealing jewelry and electronics. When they mentioned the thief's name, it was David. They'd found him hiding in one of the crew-only areas, a stash of stolen items in his bag. He'd been arrested and was being held until we reached the next port. New Year's Eve of 2019 was supposed to be just another night. At 19, living in the heart of New York City, I had plans to spend the evening with friends, watching the ball drop on TV and toasting to a new decade. But work ran late, and by the time I finally got off, a brutal snowstorm had swept in, making the streets eerily quiet. The drive home felt endless. The snow came down in thick sheets, and the roads were nearly deserted. Just me, the occasional streetlight, and the howl of the wind. My phone buzzed with texts from friends asking where I was, but I ignored them, focusing on the slippery roads ahead. That's when I saw him. A man was standing by a stalled car on the road, frantically waving his arms. His coat flapped wildly in the wind, and the hazard lights of his car blinked weakly through the snow. I hesitated. The streets were empty, and the snowstorm made it impossible to see far ahead. My gut screamed to keep driving, but guilt tugged at me. What if he really needed help? What if no one else would stop? Against my better judgment, I slowed down and rolled down my window. "Need a help?" I called out, trying to sound confident, though my heart was racing. "Yeah, my car won't start," he yelled back, his voice barely cutting through the wind. "I've been out here for hours." Something about his tone felt off. Too eager, too rehearsed. But I couldn't just drive away now. I parked a few feet ahead and stepped out, pulling my coat tight against the freezing air. The man smiled as I approached. "Thanks so much," he said, gesturing to his car. "It's dead. I just need to push to the side." I glancing at the car. That's when I felt it. A shift in the air, a flicker of movement. Before I could react, he lunged at me, shoving me backward. I stumbled, the icy ground knocking the wind out of me. Before I could get up, he grabbed me, dragging me toward his car. My mind raced as I kicked and struggled, but his grip was iron tight. "Get in the trunk," he snarled, yanking it open with one hand. Panic surged through me. I twisted, clawing at his arm, and managed to slam my elbow into his ribs. He grunted in pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I bolted back to my car, adrenaline propelling me through the snow. Behind me, he was shouting, his footsteps crunching closer. I threw myself into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. The tires skidded, but I didn't stop. My car fishtailed onto the road, and in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police, choking out the details as best I could. They told me to pull over in a safe spot and wait. Minutes later, red and blue lights flashed in the distance, cutting through the storm. I watched from my car as the police apprehended him, his protests muffled by the wind. One officer approached me, his face grim. "You're lucky," he said. "This guy's wanted for similar attacks. You probably saved yourself, and maybe someone else tonight." I nodded, numbly, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. When I finally got home that night, the clock had already struck midnight. My friends' texts had gone from cheerful wishes to worried inquiries. I sat on my bed, staring at my shaking hands, and wondered how close I had come to disappearing into that snowstorm forever. New Year's was supposed to be a quiet celebration for Amy, a solo traveler heading to visit her family. She'd booked a cruise, hoping the tranquil sea and festive atmosphere would ease the loneliness she felt spending the holiday alone. The first day aboard was uneventful. Amy enjoyed the ocean views, indulged in the buffet, and even made small talk with a few passengers. Her cabin was modest but comfortable, the perfect retreat after a day of exploring the ship. But on her second night, everything changed. Around 3 a.m., a faint knock pulled her from a deep sleep. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, then grew louder. Groggy, she stumbled to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. Amy opened the door a crack, her heart pounding in the silence. The hallway was empty, the faint hum of the ship the only sound. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to a prank or her imagination and went back to bed. But the unease lingered. Hours later, as she lay staring at the ceiling, she felt it, a presence in the room. It was subtle at first, like the faintest brush of cold air against her skin. Then it grew stronger, oppressive, as if someone was standing over her. Terrified, Amy sat up and scanned the cabin. That's when she saw it. In the corner, near the small desk, a shadowy figure loomed. Its form was indistinct, but two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto hers. Amy froze, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't approach, but its presence was suffocating, radiating a malevolence that made her stomach churn. Finally, breaking free of her paralysis, she bolted from the bed and fled the room, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor. She ran straight to the reception desk, gasping for breath as she tried to explain what had happened. Security arrived minutes later and searched the cabin. They found nothing, no shadowy figure, no evidence anyone else had been there. Amy insisted she wasn't imagining things. She knew what she'd seen. A crew member overheard her recounting the experience and pulled her aside. "You're in cabin 326, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. Amy nodded. The crew member hesitated before continuing. "That room. It's got a history. A man named Harry stayed there a few years ago. He died in that room. Heart attack, they said. But passengers who stay there often report strange things. Knocks at odd hours, cold spots, even sightings of a figure in the corner." Amy felt cold. "I'll arrange for you to move to a different cabin," the crew member offered. She didn't hesitate to accept, but even after switching rooms, the sense of dread lingered. Every knock at her door, every creak of the ship, sent her heart racing. The rest of the cruise passed in a haze of anxiety. She tried to enjoy the trip, but her thoughts kept circling back to cabin 326 and the figure with glowing red eyes. It was supposed to be a perfect way to ring in the new year. A relaxing cruise with my boss, Henry, his wife, and their teenage son, Max. I'd never been on a cruise before, and the thought of calm seas and endless buffets sounded like a dream. Henry had invited me along as a gesture of appreciation for a successful year at work. I was grateful, but I could never have imagined how quickly that dream would become a nightmare. The trip started off beautifully. Days were filled with sun-soaked decks, laughter, and good food. By New Year's Eve, everyone was in high spirits. The ship's deck was alive with music, and the countdown to midnight promised a night to remember. But as the party wound down, the atmosphere shifted. It was past 1 a.m. when Henry came to my cabin, frantic. "Max is missing," he said. I followed him to their suite, where his wife was in tears. "He went to get a soda an hour ago and hasn't come back," she said. We scoured the ship, the deck, the dining halls, the game rooms, every possible corner. Panic set in as the minutes ticked by with no sign of Max. I kept thinking, this is a cruise. He couldn't have just disappeared. Finally, just after 3 a.m., one of the crew members called out from a storage area near the engine room. "We've found him." We rushed down and found Max, tied to a chair, his face pale and tear-streaked. He was trembling, but alive. Henry untied him, pulling him into a tight embrace. Through gasping breaths, Max told us what had happened. "I was walking back to the room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "when this man grabbed me. He dragged me down here, said if I screamed, he'd hurt you all." His wide eyes darted to Henry. "He knew our names, Dad. He knew everything about us. Who would do something like this? And how did they know so much about Henry's family?" The ship's security team sprang into action, reviewing camera footage and questioning passengers. Hours later, the shocking truth emerged. The culprit was no stranger. He was someone we'd all seen, someone we'd worked with. Mark, a quiet coworker from the office. I remembered him as the guy who kept to himself, rarely speaking unless spoken to. He'd been on board the cruise, blending in with the crowd so effortlessly that no one thought twice about his presence. Security found Mark hiding in another storage area, his face calm, almost smug. When they dragged him out, Henry confronted him. "Why would you do this?" Henry demanded. "You destroyed my career," he said, his voice cold. "I just wanted you to feel powerless the way I did." Mark had been let go from the company months earlier after a series of incidents involving misconduct. Henry had been the one to make the call, though it was a justified decision. But clearly, Mark had been stewing in his resentment, planning his revenge. The cruise ended abruptly as Mark was handed over to the authorities at the next port. Max was physically unharmed but shaken, and the rest of us were left reeling from the ordeal.